earliest experiences that we had in Star Trek had to do with the animated series.
Yes, and so for the first time we're going to discuss 2 episodes from the animated series.
I remember the era when I watched the animated series, because it was definitely the late 70s to early 80s. We know that it began on September 8th, 1973, so 7 years to the day of the original series.
Yeah, that's funny. It premiered on September 8th, like the original series.
7 years to the day, which is pretty amazing. It was a Saturday morning cartoon. Oftentimes with cartoons or TV shows, I could kind of figure out when I was watching it based on the toys that I was playing along with or the comic books that I was reading while I was watching TV. This one, the animated series, I remember watching it on Saturday morning with my brother in 1980. We had 2 televisions at my grandparents' house. You got to figure when my mother and my uncle grew up and moved out, they took their bedrooms and they transformed them. So my mother's childhood bedroom ended up being a guest room. My uncle's childhood bedroom ended up being a TV room because my grandparents, and I think a lot of grandparents and parents of years ago, they used the living rooms as a formal living room. Kids were not allowed to sit on the furniture in the living room. There was no TV in the living room. The living room was used for socializing with adults. So the kids went into the TV room. 2 TVs in the house. My grandparents never wanted to get a color TV, so I watched Star Trek the Animated Series on a black and white TV. There was a 19-inch TV in the TV room. And then in the guest bedroom, there was a 13-inch portable TV. Do you remember what they considered portable TVs back then? They had like handles on the top,
yes,
but they were super heavy. And I remember it being avocado green.
But was it also a black and white TV?
It was black and white. Mm-hmm.
So you didn't care about the pink tribbles then. It was all black and white.
It didn't affect me so much. Yeah, and what was funny that I know that I was watching it in 1980, particularly at this time, because there is a television program called Kids Are People Too. So we were watching Kids Are People 2 on one television set, and it was the premiere of Eric Carr being a new member of KISS. And then Star Trek was on the other television, and my brother and I would run back and forth, waiting for KISS to come on to introduce the new drummer, and then watching Star Trek. So they were both on the same time. And my grandparents didn't like us when we'd flip the knob really quick and go click, 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 click. So we had to watch it on 2 televisions, running back and forth between rooms. That was my ultimate Star Trek memories of the animated series is that.
But what I remember is, I mean, when it first came on, I watched it, but I was really too young to really take it in at that time. Mm-hmm. But I know, once I got older, that the cable channel Nickelodeon picked up the animated series, and this must have been sometime in the 80s. And this is at a time when I was completely into Star Trek, so I was thinking, oh good, now I get to watch the animated series and really take it in and remember all the episodes. And so I had some book. It seems like it was the Star Trek catalog that had a list of all the episodes with a summary of all the episodes. So I would use that, and each episode that was on, I would mark it in that book so I could make sure that I knew when I had seen all of them. Mm-hmm. And I was keeping up with it then, watching it every Saturday, and it was pretty cool. I liked it.
And when you think there wasn't much of a break, because Star Trek ended in 1969, this debuted in 1973, so a 4-year gap. They didn't call it Star Trek the Animated Series. It was simply called Star Trek.
That is true. When it came on the screen, it said Star Trek. But there is something...
I think it was when it came out on video that they started calling it the animated series.
Yeah, it's some time because they wanted to distinguish it. It was also known as The Animated Adventures of Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek. Have you ever heard of that?
I don't recall it being that, but it makes sense.
Yeah, that they would make it something like that because Gene Roddenberry had made a name for himself as the creator of Star Trek. Yes. And so, why not call it Gene Roddenberry's Star Trek?
Filmation was the studio that produced it. And Filmation, people who criticize this type of animation weren't familiar with this stuff. Either they didn't grow up in that era, or they looked down upon it based on modern animation. But Filmation was pretty much the standard for that era. I mean, remember the Super Friends?
Yeah, which I loved. I mean, of course, but like we're saying, we grew up with it, so we liked this kind of thing. And even then, like, you could tell how Star Trek was on a budget, how they reused a lot of the same shots of like Kirk and Spock running and putting their hands up in front of their face. You could, those things that were reused over and over.
But it was the same thing with the Super Friends. How many times did you see Superman punch a rock and it was the same animation? But that was the standard of the era, to take a still and just move the mouth.
Yes, yeah.
So it was on par with animation of that time period. I think they did an incredible job of the likenesses.
Yes, it was clear who was who, and of course it was great that they got all the original voices too. So you knew you could just listen to it and watch it, and it still felt like Star Trek, didn't it?
It sure did. Lou Scheimer, Hal Sutherland, Norm Prescott, they were the ones running this studio. It started in 1963, ended in 1989, but there were some big names with regards to how many popular cartoon series and even live action series were run by Filmation. So they were in good company. We already mentioned Super Friends. They had New Adventures of Superman, The Adventures of Superboy, The Superman Aquaman Hour of Adventure, Fantastic Voyage, The Archie Show. I mean, weren't you a fan of Archie's?
Yes, I remember it in the 70s. That one came on, well, they might have been a Saturday morning version, but I remember watching it after school on weekdays.
Sure. The Hardy Boys.
Yes.
The Adventures of Batman. Sabrina and the Groovy Ghoulies. How about the Fat Albert and the Cosby Kids?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And what about, didn't Filmation do Tarzan, Lord of the Jungle? That was one of my favorites.
Exactly. Shazam. That was live action.
Yeah.
I mean, these
Shazam
were all,
and ISIS.
Absolutely. New Adventures of Flash Gordon, Black Star. One of the most popular Filmation productions was He-Man and the Masters of the Universe, as well as She-Ra.
Yeah, those were great shows, which we've already covered on the podcast. I mean, they're just wonderful.
And when you think about that format of that animation style, they were pretty consistent from the 70s to the 80s, because look at the He-Man show. How many times there was repetitive animation in there? I never thought that was a flaw. I viewed it as a sort of consistency.
Yeah, you just see it and you kind of expect it, and it feels right because it continues the flow once you're used to it. You're like, yeah, that's what they do.
And even some of the shots for the Enterprise, they took the cells and traced it over the original film of the Enterprise. So they got that animation right on a technical level, which I thought was wonderful.
I think they were careful to do that. They wanted to get it right. Mm-hmm. I mean, Gene Roddenberry was in charge of this, and he also got Dorothy Fontana to be the associate producer or the story editor. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, yeah, they cared about this. They wanted it to be Star Trek.
Well, let's talk about that. Dorothy Fontana was reaching out to a lot of past writers of Star Trek and hoping that they would get involved in this project. Now, granted, it would be roughly half the time length of a Star Trek episode. Each animated episode was 22 minutes. And since it was a Saturday morning cartoon, the writers would not be paid as much, not only for the time, but also for the format. And she relates that nearly everyone wanted to get involved, wanted to get back into Star Trek.
And another thing, I mean, the writers in some ways did like that it was animated because they could have, like they could smash galaxies and they didn't have to worry about the budget. I mean, so the writers actually felt like they had more freedom with this.
Exactly. They could tell the stories that they normally would only tell in novel format, but an artist can draw anything. So there were no limitations. And this was especially exciting for us because we were able to see different aliens on the crew of the Enterprise.
like RX and Maress.
Which was wonderful.
I mean,
I love them.
They would have been expensive to make in real life. Of course, now we could do it in real life. It would be neat to see them. But yeah, just seeing them on the Enterprise, you have these really alien-looking aliens. It was really cool, and the kids must have really liked it better back then, just like we did.
We see that there was a replacement of one major character, that being Chekhov. Walter Koenig was not invited back to do voice work. Now, we understand voice work. The reason why so many voice actors do double and triple duty on any animated series is because the less people you bring in, the less money it costs. So originally, they only wanted the main come in. But the ones that were left out were George Takei and Nichelle Nichols. And Leonard Nimoy spoke up and said, okay, they're not, you might not view them as much core characters, but also, you know, you're leaving out the ethnic people. It's kind of wrong to do that, you know, on multiple levels. They're part of the team. They've been with us since the beginning. I don't know if I want to get involved in this project unless they're involved too.
Can you imagine him standing up like that? I mean, it's one of the reasons we admire him.
That's amazing.
Yeah, and he actually he got them to keep on Nichelle and George.
And their characters were fleshed out even more because of this series. So I'm so happy that they were involved in this project.
I mean, and it was great to see them there. I mean, even though, like Nichelle, she did Uhura, but she also did Maress.
Yes.
So, you know, so we didn't really get to see Uhura in every episode of this, but that was okay.
But we got to see her take command of the ship, and Nichelle marks that as one of the high spots of her character. So we have an actual Star Trek actor saying that because of the animated series, it added more development to her character.
And that was one of my favorite episodes too. And
it was great.
Yeah. And it was something that Nichelle loved doing.
George Takei would end up being a voice actor afterwards too, even in Star Wars. He's one of the crossover actors. There's roughly a dozen that have done work with Star Wars and Star Trek, and the bulk of them, it's because of Star Wars animated. But George has the distinction of being involved in two animated series with that, Star Wars and Star Trek. So this laid the groundwork of further things that George would do.
And also, Walter Koenig, they didn't have the budget to bring him back to do Chekhov, but they allowed him to write an episode.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to talk about that because he is a writer and he enjoyed writing and he wanted to break through and start doing more things. I remember seeing the ads in Starlog magazine about Walter's novels and thinking, wow, that's so fascinating that he could be an actor and a science fiction writer too. Yeah,
that was cool. I mean, so he had his own way of branching out too.
So we have to look at what point did they want to produce this series? Well, the series went underway pretty quickly.
There was talk about doing it right after the original series ended, and they had talked about it. But then there was something going on. Like Scheimer wanted to do it, and Gene wanted to do it, but something happened because Gene at the time didn't have a good relation with the network, and so the idea was put aside at that time. It was scrapped. So, but then later in '73, because of the popularity of the original series in syndication, they decided to do this animated series.
And they ended up expressing this idea at a Star Trek convention, and Lou Scheimer actually hosted a panel throwing out the idea, and he is quoted by saying, when they, that is the fans, saw how much we cared and how faithful we are at trying to be the original series, I think they realized that they really have Star Trek back again.
That's amazing. And
so think about that they really care. At that time, Star Trek cared enough to get the people involved to interact with the fans and say, well, what do you think about this? This is what we're planning. We want to keep it close to the original. We're not going to go off on some wild tangents.
What are you hinting at?
We're not going to pull people in who have no idea what this series is about. And this goes back to Dorothy Fontana. She reached out to previous Star Trek writers. And what did we get?
we got a great show that is Star Trek.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of things too, like they added things in that, or things that had never been said before, such as James T. Kirk. What does the T stand for? They never really said it on screen until the animated series that it's Tiberius.
Mm-hmm. And that became established canon, that is his middle name. So I loved the series growing up, and we always say, how do we feel about it now as opposed to when we were younger? And that is everything that we review. Some things don't hold up to our adulthood. Well, we're going to talk about that. Let's do an episode-by-episode breakdown. We'll start out with 2 episodes that we watched in a group setting. Beyond the Farthest Star. Now, when I was younger, I don't remember any outstanding episodes with the exception of the Tribble episode. And I remember episodes with the Klingons. I don't remember specifically watching this as a child, but later on with the advent, and it came up pretty late. I think it was like the late 80s when they came out on VHS tapes. I was getting them from the video store and renting them. Let's talk about this episode. Let's read the commentary in Alan Asherman's Star Trek Compendium.
Stardate 5521.3. Pulled off course by Questar M17 and imploded negative star mass, the Enterprise discovers a strange starship inhabited by a formless and evil alien life form. The ship's builders had failed to rid themselves of the creature and attempted to destroy their vessel rather than risking bringing the malevolent entity to civilization. The creature takes control of the Enterprise, but Kirk and Spock, by heading directly toward Questar M17, trick the entity into believing they are about to destroy themselves, and the creature flees. Using a slingshot effect, the Enterprise escapes Questar's gravity pull, leaving the alien trapped in orbit around the dead star.
Right, this episode was written by Sam Peoples, veteran Star Trek writer. Let's see what some of our friends said after viewing it when we watched it together.
Chris from Muncie. I like how, with animated series you can do visuals and places that are beyond what, the budget of, the original series or most television was back then. So the fantastical kind of strange ship they've come across, you can never do that in, live television. And the writing's excellent, and it's Star Trek. It's fantastic.
Hi, I'm Savannah. I love the animated series. I'm from Indianapolis, is where we are. I'm really sleepy. It should be said that it is early. And echoing what Chris said, I do like that they can do fun things like have non-bipedal life forms and other things that would be logistically really hard to create. And I like the campiness of it because it's ridiculous. It's like that old He-Man and, but a little bit less budget. It's fantastic. And the scripts are good. The scripts are still good, even though the animation is silly.
Hi, my name is Brian. I'm from Toronto, up in Ontario. I've always loved the animated series and the off-the-wall nature of it. And it does have a detriment where it's using Scooby-Doo sound effects for what's supposed to be serious scenes. So they're trying to rescue Scotty, and you have that bonk sound in the middle of it. But I have to say, my main thought about the end of this episode is I'm very sure that Kirk is regretting installing a big laser in the top of the bridge that can shoot them. I think they're probably going to take that out after this.
All right, what'd you think about the episode, Cutie Pie?
It was pretty good. It really wasn't one of my favorites, but I can appreciate it more now, seeing it again. The visuals were great, weren't they? The way they drew the ship, and then going onto the ship and seeing all the octagonal shapes and colors.
I really like the fact that we're talking about how this format, animation, you could tell the stories on a whole different level that you would never be able to tell those stories during the original series airing. Without CGI, how would you make this massive, massive alien ship? Or build a model that would be ridiculously expensive?
Yeah, because on the original series, they just used models. And this one, you know, when you saw the visual for this ship, it was bigger than the Enterprise because they had the Enterprise next to it. I mean, it was huge.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and it's like, how could they have made something like that and made it look real?
So that's right off the bat. We know that the writers are excited because they could tell a story on this level. I like the idea that we had Lieutenant Kyle. So we got to see him again. But he grew a mustache. Because this is considered the 4th season of Star Trek. So it makes sense.
And maybe they did that to kind of distinguish him from, Scotty, who also wore a red shirt.
That's true. But it was the 70s. So it was the porn stash.
Okay. But you know how Kyle had he had a goatee later in the movies when they showed him again. So
exactly. And so they use that as oftentimes we as fans make that the transition. Because how often when I grow facial hair, I do it in stages.
Yeah, you could say that.
So it's great seeing him again. Multiple voices that are used, but everything was cohesive. We have to talk about the talents of the voice actors who did different voices, especially James Doohan.
Yeah, another thing, because as a child, I couldn't tell that it was that he did a lot of the same voices. I mean, now listening to it now, it's pretty obvious to me. Yeah, of course that's Jimmy Doohan.
As a kid, I didn't notice either.
I mean, did you know? I just have to say that, like on Fat Albert, Bill Cosby didn't he do all the voices?
I think so.
And I never knew that as a child. So yeah, I mean, so you can kind of get away with this more with cartoons that are for children because they don't know it. They just think it's great. Hey, I'm watching a great show.
And this was the first aired episode, Beyond the Farthest Star. And let's look at TV Guide. We happen to have the TV Guide from that week. It happened to be the fall preview episode. And if anybody's TV Guide collectors, you know that the fall preview episodes tend to be a little bit more expensive than your standard issues because it shows all the new things that are coming out. But let's look at it. What else was going on in the world of Saturday morning cartoons during that time period? What would you be either flipping channels with or running back and forward to different rooms to watch? Now, different markets aired at different times. What's curious, when we look at the TV Guide listing, there were no ads promoting the Star Trek, this new Star Trek, in the TV Guide. Because when we looked at the original TV Guide from September 8th, 1966, there was a big full-page ad advertising Star Trek. Remember that?
Yes, yeah.
But nothing promoting this
and
new
series. That's the network, right? The network would have bought an ad in TV Guide.
Yes, and most of the ads for the new Saturday morning cartoons would list all the new shows at once. So this wouldn't be a specific ad just for Star Trek. So there were no ads promoting this episode or this series. But let's see what else was on during that time period. Here's what was going on at 9:30 in the morning. It was the debut of the I Dream of Jeannie.
Oh, the cartoon?
The cartoon called Jeannie.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. There was Goober and the Ghost Chasers. So those were two that were going on at 9:30. Let's back up a little bit. 9 o'clock, My Favorite Martians. Butch Cassidy. Lassie's Rescue Rangers. So let's say at 9:30, what would you have watched? My Favorite Martians, Butch Cassidy, which was a rock music cartoon adventure, or Lassie's Rescue Rangers?
I don't know about that. You said that was at 9 or what?
9 o'clock in the morning. I think I would have watched My Favorite Martians.
Yeah, probably.
Okay. So obviously between the two, Genie and Star Trek, and the Ghost Chasers, we know that we're going to watch Star Trek. Afterwards, 10 o'clock, Speed Buggy, Sigmund and the Sea Monsters, the Brady Kids, Drop In, or Wrestling.
Okay.
Boy, Wrestling, 1973. Be curious, huh?
Yeah, well, that was real wrestling. That wasn't a kid's show. I mean,
how real could it have been?
Yeah, I mean, real as
probably
in
Haystacks,
whatever
Calhoun
people,
days.
the wrestling that people used to watch back then,
Yeah.
that my parents used to watch.
Which would you have watched?
I
like
watched
Sigmund.
Speed Buggy.
Did
actually.
you watch Speed?
Yeah.
I like Sigmund and Sea Monsters better. Okay.
But yeah, just hearing those shows, you know that that was such a heyday for kids back then with the Saturday morning cartoons, and they don't have that anymore. But it was just such a great time for us.
Oh, it was. It was the time for eating cereal, keeping our jammies on, and just going cartoon after cartoon. I liked the episode. What'd you say about it?
I liked it. I
thought it was a little bit too
more,
fast-paced.
Yeah.
I thought it was too fast-paced. It needed more character development. I liked the idea that they added a new weapon, which was kind of unreasonable. Remember the new weapon on the bridge? It just popped down.
That globe thing that fired the phaser.
Mm-hmm.
And that's also, they made it look like that's also what the creature spoke from. And I think this was the only episode that had that.
Yes.
It's like they added it in just for the effect of having the creature that took over the ship.
Totally. What'd you think about the visuals of the interior of the ship? You mentioned the hexagonal shapes.
Yeah, I liked all of that in the inside of the alien ship. It was really neat. It had all the colors. It just had the great visuals. I mean, it's like there's something to see everywhere.
Mm-hmm. Totally. I agree. I think the episode was effective in that it kept true to Star Trek.
Well, the story, it was a good story, but in some ways, I mean, yeah, there have been Star Trek stories like that. It's just that you see this creature that is lonely, and they leave him.
Like Charlie X. Okay, get out of here. You're an idiot. Get out of here. You're going to be by yourself now on a planet.
Yeah, it didn't turn out that the evil being turned out to be good or something like that, but he actually was evil, and they really did have to leave him behind. They couldn't help him. He was just too evil, too far gone.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, agreed.
But he didn't really, like, it wasn't until the end when they left him that he started saying that he was lonely. Like, we never knew, well, I mean, yeah, it would make sense that he was lonely, but that just wasn't emphasized before.
He was there for a minute and a half and already he's lonely?
Yeah, because during the whole episode he kept saying, "Obey me." you know, he wasn't really acting lonely.
We need a Star Trek fan film to go into this episode. Do you remember how Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, explored the idea, well, what happened to Khan after he was left on the planet? Well, now we need a follow-up. What happened to this green mist creature that was left on the planet?
Yeah, probably nothing. They go back and find he's still angry, and if he had a chance, he would still take over another ship.
45, this is the 45th anniversary, right, of Star Trek the Animated Series. Imagine that. 45 years later, what happened to this creature that was so lonely? All right, so let's talk about the novelization, or the adaptation, we should say. Alan Dean Foster.
Great writer.
Great writer.
And he loves Star Trek. That's the thing. We know he's a Star Trek fan.
Now, when we do the original series reviews, we watch the show and then we read the adaptation. Now, we know that in the original series adaptations, they're very condensed. When we get the log books of these adaptations, it's the exact opposite. They're expanded.
For the animated series, each episode is short, but when you read the novelization of it, they actually made it longer. It's still not a complete book, but it's like several chapters.
I love this format. I absolutely loved reading the adaptation. The adaptation, you could tell, is more what Sam Peoples was comfortable with because it adds a lot of dialogue that was not able to fit in the 22-minute format of the series. Going forward, I am going to read the adaptation first and then watch the show because the adaptation adds so much more that you really feel like this is original series Star Trek.
It was a very interesting read, and it just felt like it was its own story. And you know, because we were saying, like, for the original series episodes, a lot of stuff got left out of the adaptations. And like, if you read the adaptation and didn't know the episode, you would be lost because it just goes from one scene to the next with no transitions. But this novelization, or this adaptation, actually had, you know, it took its time and developed the story.
I like the adaptations because this is more geared towards an adult audience. Things that they put in here that possibly could have been in the live action series, but definitely would not be in the children's Saturday morning episodes. Okay, so I'll give you an example. They're looking at the spaceship, the abandoned ship, and it's very organic in shape. It's not hard lines. It's all soft edges, bright colors. And Uhura says, I just know that it's beautiful. To have put such grace and perfection of form into something as functional as a starship, I wish I could have known the race that built it. Beauty may have nothing to do with it, Lieutenant, suggested Spock. The design may merely conform to their own conceptions of spatial dynamics. She turned back to her instruments, an expression of distaste coming over her perfect features. I might have guessed you'd say something like that, Spock. Don't give it a thought, Uhura, chipped in McCoy quickly. According to his own system of spatial dynamics, Spock probably finds your form purely functional. Don't you, Spock? Sulu grinned, and even Kirk was distracted enough to smile. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Uhura is intelligent, very capable with her responsibilities, but she has a beautiful form. And that was the point that McCoy was making. Would that line have slipped into the original series?
Maybe it could have.
Possibly, possibly not. That would have been on the edge. No possible way that would have been in the animated series.
No, they did mention that the animated series was in some way for adults, but also in some way for kids. They tried to keep out any sexual references from the animated.
Yes. I very much enjoy this adaptation, how it spoke about the metal of the ship, because the metal was very unique forms to it. It broke down the dynamics of how strong it was, but how light it was. It added more the technical aspect. It also, because it had different hexagons throughout the ship, it noted the insect-like formations, and it went more into the background of how insects would have this form, especially bees, honeycombs. I mean, we're looking at more background information on the ship's formation in this, as well as character banter.
That was another good part about reading about it. Yeah, I definitely recommend these Star Trek logs by Alan Dean Foster.
Because we're getting somewhat of a background of this alien species.
They do talk more that it might have been close to an insect species. Mm-hmm. Now on the episode, they had the visual of the captain talking when he made his recording. I think that was supposed to be his head that they showed on the screen.
I
right?
think so too, but I didn't get that it was as insect-like as the book brings out, because we only saw his head, and it was just for a brief period of time.
Yeah, and I think they made it look distorted intentionally, right? Yes.
We're also getting more details about these life support belts. We know that the real reason for the life support belts on the series was because it was a cost-cutting measure. They wouldn't have to reanimate entire suits. Simply draw a belt over the characters and put a halo around them.
I remember reading something for like the Tholian Web when they were wearing those suits, and someone had the idea to actually just say, like, well, they can just wear a belt and have a force field around them instead of wearing those suits. And then someone else said, well, we don't want to do that just because of, they said there might be some kind of repercussions later down the line in another episode.
I didn't realize that. So this idea was during the original series era, that was something that was being tossed around?
It was, yeah. Oh, I mean, yeah, just like the recreation room, which is like the holodeck on the Next Generation.
Mm-hmm.
But the holodeck on the Next Generation was actually used in some of the animated episodes. They called it something else. I think they called it the rec room.
Mm-hmm.
Because they had the idea for the original series to do something like that, but they did not have the budget to do that, where you could just create anything that you could imagine in a room on the ship.
Yeah, true. Also, the conflict towards the end with the bridge crew trying to dodge the lasers of the security unit.
Yes.
On the bridge. This was really drawn out. We're getting more emotion of what each person on the bridge was thinking, what they were strategizing, because the show could only do so much in a short time span. I was reading this and I could not put it down. I said, this is really shows that this is Star Trek. For those who say, nah, I'm not going to watch the animated series because it seems silly, please don't think that. Not at all.
Yeah, this brings the episode up a level,
mm-hmm.
Yes.
So especially after reading the adaptation, we both agree that we got more out of the episode. We understand Sam Peoples' true idea of what it would be like if it was a 1 hour episode, or shy of an hour with commercials. We both give it thumbs up. Let's talk about, does this work with the rest of Star Trek, this episode?
I think it does. It's a well-told story. It's about searching and exploring and finding something new. Yes, definitely.
Nothing that is absurd that would break the rest of canon or conflicts any other ideas.
They pretty much tried to stick with canon with these.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yeah. Great. We enjoyed it. Now we're going to talk about the Infinite Vulcan. We did watch this together with a group of friends, so let's see what their response was directly after viewing this episode.
Hi, Morris from New York. I like the way the crew works together to solve problems, and they help each other out. I like the voices. It sounds like the original actors.
My name's Ryan. I'm from Indianapolis, Indiana, and I just love classic animation and how they actually pulled this off by getting the original cast back together and continuing the voyages. Mm-hmm. And the fact they bring in some things like for classic series like the IDIC, mm-hmm. and the theology goes along with that, and the fact that Shatner made the argument, like Kirk made the argument that about that, and Kirk or Spock reminded him the fact that it's a good argument, and so they actually solved the episode through words instead of actions.
Okay, baby doll. What does Alan Asherman's Star Trek Compendium have to say about the Infinite Vulcan?
Okay, the Infinite Vulcan written by Walter Koenig. Stardate 5554.4. On the planet Phylos, an Enterprise landing party discovers Caniculus 5, a cloned giant of Dr. Stavros Caniclius, a Terran scientist who lived during the eugenics wars. The giant wishes to clone Spock to use as a galactic peacemaker, refusing to believe Kirk's claims that the galaxy is an almost totally peaceful group of civilized worlds. Caniclius clones one giant from the Vulcan, which weakens Spock to the point of death. Kirk, citing the Vulcan philosophy of life and death, makes the clone realize he is simply a copy of Spock. The replicant, using the Vulcan mind touch, saves the original's life. The Caniclius and Spock clones remain behind on Phylos to revitalize its culture.
I rather enjoyed this episode. What did you think?
I enjoyed it too.
So let's talk about some of the minutia of it. We saw that little plant, a little kind of a dandelion walking around called the retlau.
Oh yeah, the little retlau plant.
He's a cute little guy, wasn't he?
Doesn't he kind of look like a tribble? I mean.
And how did that name come to be, retlau?
It is the writer, Walter, spelled backwards.
So, even though Walter Koenig was not in this episode, as his character Chekhov, he did work his name into it.
Yes. And, well, he actually did, he intended to play Caniglius. He wanted to play that part, and they let him audition for it, and they didn't choose him, and he kind of felt like they were really just being nice, just letting him audition. Like, he kind of felt like they really never really wanted him to do the voice, but they let him audition.
And in fact, he was starting to establish himself as a writer. We know that later on he would have a diary that would be published, The Making of Star Trek the Motion Picture. Do you remember that, Chekhov's Enterprise?
Yes, I loved that book.
It's great. And then Buck Alice and the actor Robot, he started getting into the fantasy genre, science fiction. So he does have that ability to write something for television. And he was offered other parts to write for, or I should say other episodes to write for, but he refused because he said Gene Roddenberry was too hard to work with. He made him rewrite just this short 20-something minute episode nearly a dozen times.
Yeah, he really didn't like having to do so many rewrites, which I can understand too. And yeah, so now he must know how Harlan Ellison felt, huh, with all the rewrites that were done on his episode.
And from what I understand, originally these weren't going to be plant creatures, but that's something Gene Roddenberry pushed for because of the fact that Gene wanted to have this on the original series, but budget restraints wouldn't allow them to make plant creatures that looked real. So Gene brought up that idea.
Because it's an animated series, and there's, you might as well take advantage of the most alien-looking creatures you can. Mm-hmm. And so they had that idea, and the way I keep hearing it described is that they are vegetables.
It's kind of like an asparagus.
Yeah, and so it reminds me, there's an episode of Lost in Space, remember the talking carrot? And
horrible.
Okay, it makes you wonder though, is that what Gene had in mind, the Lost in Space episode? And I like that Spock was prominent in this. Well, in some ways it reminded me of Spock's brain, because in Spock's brain they chose Spock because his brain was the best they could find, and in this episode they chose Spock to clone because they thought that he would be the best to lead the peaceful exploits they were trying to do, conquer the galaxy with peace.
And did you notice that McCoy specifically shouted out Spock's brain? So I think that was one of the things that Walter put in there specifically because McCoy was an integral part to that episode, Spock's brain. So I think that is a little in-house humor of this is a bit ridiculous. Yeah. Now we're going to have this giant Spock use his finger, and his finger is going to touch Spock and mind meld with him.
That was strange too. Yeah, that was kind of hard to look at when they showed it. I think that was one thing they couldn't quite figure out how to visualize, and so it just didn't look right when he did that. But they did mention infinite diversity and infinite combinations.
Yes.
This is actually the first episode where they actually said that string of words altogether. It wasn't really stated exactly in Is There in Truth No Beauty?
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's true.
And this was, the episode taught a good lesson for children that, even with good intentions, you still can't just conquer the galaxy, even though their intention was to create peace. They were trying to force peace. You could almost say that's what the Borg were trying to do too, by assimilating people. It would have caused peace if they had actually assimilated everybody.
Mm-hmm. one of the questions that we ask ourselves whenever we review an episode is, does it fit in with the rest of canon? Does it add to it, or does it do anything contrary to it? I'd say this fits in so many ways. One reason is because it's the first time that the United Federation of Planets is affirmed as being founded in the 22nd century.
Yes.
And later on, that becomes, in the Enterprise TV show, we see that that's what it leads up to. Also, it does mention the eugenic wars, a reference to Space Seed.
Yes, and that was good too. They were saying that Canucleus was on Earth during that time. So we don't know if he really was one of Khan's people or anything. He might have just been a research scientist, but yeah, I mean that was great, that reference there.
And so we can ascertain that Walter Koenig did his homework, because he wasn't on that first season of Star Trek. But he knew what an important episode that would have been in Star Trek history, and at that point, Space Seed wasn't an important episode, but in Star Trek history, the eugenic wars were something.
Yes, isn't that great? Because Walter put that in, so he knew about the episode Space Seed, even though he wasn't in it. But Khan will recognize him later. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and this was even before Star Trek II: The Wrath of Khan. So he made a reference to an episode that would just become so hugely popular later.
Let's talk a little bit about the adaptation by Alan Dean Foster. It is found in Star Trek Log 2. Now we know that Alan Dean Foster based his adaptation on the script by Walter Koenig. This one, yes, it did add some to it, more descriptive. I think the plants in here were far more descriptive than what we saw on screen. It would actually went into detail of the little Bratlaw plant, how it would not only go into the ground, but it would actually corkscrew into the ground. It would make a popping sound going in and out.
Yeah, that was a great idea to add that. I mean, yeah, to put more detail in and to say that it actually has a sound was neat.
Mm-hmm. I also like the fact that it went more into detail about McCoy's family history. Yes, the episode did mention that McCoy's great-grandfather was a farmer, not a writer by trade at this point. The other writers that were before him really had some background in writing, so I'm going to assume that he had to study these Star Trek episodes a little bit more than anyone else.
Well, if he was the one who put all that in, I mean, it could have been added by Gene or by
It's a good
Fontana.
Point. That's a good point.
But I mean, DC Fontana mentioned that she was impressed with Walter's writing of this episode. So the story actually, the book had more of a description when they were walking through, Kirk and McCoy were trying to find Spock, and they were walking through the tunnel, was it? And it was dark.
Yes.
I mean, that was a much more vivid description of that scene.
Also of note with the adaptation, when it was time for the crew to enter the building, there was a keypad with 3 panels on it. And in the animated series, Spock pulled out his phaser and shot it. But in the adaptation, it was interesting because Spock had to use his logic, and it was more like a puzzle of how he placed his hands and used that 3-piece keypad in order to enter. It made me feel more like an Indiana Jones movie, where he had to figure out a puzzle in order to enter the next room. And I think that fit in better with Spock's personality, because Spock was always looking to solve a problem instead of pulling out his phaser. So again, the adaptation, I think, is more apt to the characters in many ways because it's giving more time. Maybe the episode didn't have time to show that, so they looked for a quick fix.
And it might be easier to look at, things like the Vulcan mind meld, Spock, the giant Spock, doing it on the regular size Spock.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you could visualize it a lot better than the way they actually showed it on screen. And a lot of the summaries of this refer to the giant Spock as Spock 2.
That is true. I've noticed that.
I mean, I would have just called him Giant Spock, I think. And they said that there really wasn't an explanation for Caniclius being 20 feet tall and making the clone of Spock 20 feet tall, right? There wasn't.
Well, I think Caniclius was more than 20 feet tall.
Was it 50 feet or
50,
whatever it was?
Like 50 something feet, yes.
But I mean, the reason for it wasn't really explained.
No, even in here it wasn't.
I mean, he was a human. The original one was human, so he would be, regular height. But he cloned himself. And so he must have just made the clone larger. It has been said maybe the Phylosians were actually, maybe their ancestors were taller, and their ships could have been built where only giants could run their ships. But I don't think it was actually mentioned.
Mm-hmm. Here it is. I like this part that draws on McCoy's background, and this was expressed in the series too on the cartoon. But as it's worded here, well, how about that? McCoy mused, studying the corpse-laden battlefield. Great Grandpappy's weed spray still works. So we know that Dr. McCoy was an old Southern doctor, and if he had a great Grandpappy, we'd assume he was a farmer making weed spray.
I mean, I kind of took that to mean like to be more of an expression than a fact. But I mean,
oh, okay,
okay.
You didn't think it was really his great Grandpappy that developed that weed spray?
No.
You think his great Grandpappy created Roundup?
He could have
worked for Monsanto.
What do you think about the Phylosians? The way they looked.
I mean, like the way they looked.
Yeah, they did look like plants, but they did look alien. It was a good look. It was something good for an animated series that I don't think they could have done on a live action show and made it look that good.
The show we enjoyed, as well as the adaptation. One other unique thing about the adaptation that was different than the show that I'm thinking about now is the birds that were in the show, or I should say like dragon-like creatures. Do you remember in the adaptation, they weren't described like that. They weren't like little baby dragons with tentacles hanging out. It actually said that the body went back and forth, almost like its rib cage was going in and out, and that's what made it a flapping sound.
Yeah, I think it sounded like the way they flew was different, so they weren't really like birds. It was something else.
Yes. In the show, they made it more of a standard reptilian type creature, whereas this was extremely alien in the adaptation. So why they changed it, I don't know. It might have been for the sake of the animators wanting something with the sake of normalcy, because the vegetable aliens were so different. They wanted something that looked fairly common to kids' eyes.
Yeah,
I have no idea.
That could be.
Mm-hmm. But great episode, great adaptation.
Thanks for joining us on this away mission.
Please give us a 5-star review on your podcast app.
This helps others find out about us too.
We welcome feedback and comments. Drop us a subspace transmission via starpodlog@gmail.com. That's starpodlog@gmail.com.
Music for this episode provided by 5-Year Mission. Until next time, live long and prosper.